Have you ever noticed that households do not run themselves? Someone has to run households. And I give my husband a tremendous amount of credit because he and I were a real team, and I think that has made all the difference. So relationships matter. And then the last one I'll end on, and then I'd love to go to questions. My mother, who had enormous influence on me, really did have a bias for action. Mother was not a whiner. She was not a ditherer. Mom had a bias for action. And I'll tell you a little story that I think will give you an insight into how I was raised. During World War II, my mother lived in Boston. She was raised in Boston. And she wanted to join the war effort, like so many of that generation. And so in 1941, she signed up to join the Red Cross. And I think she thought she'd stay in Boston and it would be quite safe. The first day she showed up to work, and they said, "This class of women, we need you to go to Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific." So they flew from Boston to San Francisco and then got on a troop ship for 30 days to New Guinea. My mother said the very best thing about this troop ship was she got seasick and lost 30 pounds. She lands in New Guinea, and the base commander meets this group of women. And he says, "We do not have enough airplane mechanics and enough truck mechanics. Which of you women would like to volunteer?" Trust me, my mother had never looked under the hood of anything. But she raised her hand because she knew that was where the need was greatest. And the learning curve actually fueled her. It did not deter her, it fueled her. 4 years later, Mom was a certified airplane and truck mechanic. And growing up, she always used to say to my sister and my brother and me, "You can do anything you want because I can overhaul a Jeep engine faster than a man." Another interesting story about a bias for action, also from my mother. And I have to tell you, this is a little bittersweet for me because one of the great fun things about writing this book is I got to reflect on the influence that my mother and my father had on me. But my mother died on January 18th. And so the good news was we got to read her this book. She was very sick at the end, and my brother and my sister and I took turns reading this book to her. And but another great story, which if she would hear, she would want me to tell, is in 1973, my mother went to China. And she went with Shirley MacLaine's women's delegation. I don't know how many of you remember this, but do you remember Nixon had opened China to the Western world for the first time in decades? And he had sent in a ping pong delegation as sort of the first diplomatic olive branch, if you will. And the next group in was Shirley MacLaine, who had gotten permission from the Chinese government to make a documentary called The Other Half of the Sky, a China Memoir. And Shirley had put together a group of women from all different walks of life. A 12-year-old girl, a Navajo Indian, a labor leader, an attorney, I love this, a sex therapist from San Francisco. Why do we always get tagged that way? Anyway, there was a slot for a rock-ribbed Republican who could wear a peck-and-peck suit. For those of you who are younger, a peck-and-peck suit was sort of the uniform of the day of traditional Republican women. And someone had this spot on the trip, but at the last minute she had to drop out. And so the organizer of the trip got my mother's name from this woman, and she said, "We're going to China, we're leaving in 7 days, can you come?" And I'll never forget it, my mother picked me and my best friend up. I was a senior in high school, and she said, "We're driving to New York City, I'm interviewing with Shirley MacLaine to go to China." And then she looked at me and she goes, "Who's Shirley MacLaine?" But there were lots of reasons not to go to China, weren't there? What would it be like? It was just open to the West. You know, what would the food be like? Would it be safe? But my mother had a bias for action. And she taught us very early on the price of inaction is probably far greater than the cost of making a mistake. What's the worst thing that can happen? But what's the best thing that can happen? And China in some ways changed my mother's life. She saw the all-female camera crew, who were all in their 20s, doing things that really hadn't been open to her generation. She saw women in China doing all kinds of things, because of course in communist China, women did everything. And she came back to my sister and me and she said, "You know what? You can do anything you want. Whatever will make you happy, wherever you think you will have an impact." I've sort of had a different perspective than I had even just 3 weeks ago. So Mom definitely had a bias for action that she certainly passed on to my sister and my brother and me. And it's a good thing, because I think you have to have a bias for action if you're going to run for governor of California. There's lots of reasons not to do this. But in the end, the reason that I have decided to run for governor is I just refuse to believe that California cannot be better than it is. This breaks my heart to watch what is happening to our great state. And you know, it matters to America, because where goes California, goes the country. And we have got to turn this state around. We can't abide with a 12.5% unemployment rate. You know what that means? That's over 2.3 million Californians who don't have a job. And I see that heartbreak on the campaign trail every day. Just the other day, I was talking to a young man who couldn't this past fall go back to the University of California at Berkeley because fees had gone up by 32%, and his mother had lost her job, and it was only his dad had a job. I talked to people who have lost their houses, not for bad loans that they couldn't afford, but they counted on 2 incomes to be able to pay that mortgage, and they can no longer afford it. I was talking to a company down in San Bernardino, Riverside the other day, one of the largest John Deere tractor dealerships in the world. And they're letting go people who have worked for their company for 30 years. So we have got to get about this unemployment situation. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we have an unemployment rate that is unsustainably high. We have an infrastructure that was built for a population half our size. The water crisis in the Central Valley is a great example. We have a kindergarten through 12th grade education system that is now at the bottom of the barrel. Depending on what score you look at, we're somewhere between 46 out of 50 states and 48 out of 50 states. In the 1950s, we had among the very best public school systems in the country. People moved to California to put their kids in our schools in the 50s. And then last but not least, the state is effectively bankrupt. Once again, we're facing a $20 billion budget deficit over the next 18 months. So, as I said, I just refuse to believe we can't be better than we are. And so I have a bias for action, and I want to take a different approach. And here's the approach, because we have got to do something differently. The same old approach won't work. I am a big believer in focus. Could we please do 3 things at 100%, as opposed to try to do 20 things at 10%? Because the devil is in the detail. I also think if you go to Sacramento with too broad an agenda, you will be stymied at every turn by the legislature, by the incumbent interest, by the bureaucracy. So I want to focus on 3 things, and we can talk more about that later if you'd like. But first is, we have to create jobs in California, and we have to keep jobs in California. Because unless we put people back to work, there is no way out of this mess. If I could do one thing, it would be to change the business climate in California and encourage people to start businesses here and to keep businesses here. You know, government doesn't create jobs. I laugh when I hear government officials say, we have to create jobs. Government doesn't create jobs. Government creates the conditions for small businesses to grow and thrive. And sometimes little businesses like eBay become big businesses like eBay. So we've got to focus on jobs. My second priority is government spending. Unfortunately, we have a government we can no longer afford. That is the true fact. So how are we going to try to do more with less?